Hey guys, so for this lecture we'll look at how high inflation can affect the unemployment rate. Now we know that the unemployment rate, or unemployment in general, consists of two different types of unemployment. So first we have natural unemployment, and secondly we have cyclical unemployment. And this is to do with, say, supply side factors, and this is to do with demand side factors. Now, as we know, in times of high inflation, aggregate demand would go down. And see, we have aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And so as we know, we talked about in previous lectures, when inflation is high, consumption would go down because we have a tendency to save for precautionary matters. So precautionary savings will increase. And so will investment spending will go down because we know that businesses will tend to move away from productive investments, productive to speculative investments. So what I mean by that is they'll stop investing in capital or research and development because of the slowing out of demand and because of the low consumer confidence. So that's why investment spending will go down, and they'll speculate in shares and other such financial debt instruments. And also we know that our exports would decrease because we've become less internationally competitive. Now, for an in-depth analysis of why these 3 points are what they are, look at subsequent lectures on high inflation and its effect on international competitiveness, which is X, high inflation and its effect on consumption, and high inflation and its effect on resource allocation or capital efficiency, which is I. But for now, we'll assume that C decreases, I decreases, and X decreases, and overall we have a very large decrease in aggregate demand. And so what we know is that in the short term, inflation, in the short term, aggregate supply is determined by aggregate demand. So what happens here is that in the short run, when high inflation occurs, aggregate demand will shift to the left. So let's look at this concept in terms of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. So we know aggregate supply and aggregate demand. In the short run, inflation is constant, and in the long run, we have a long run aggregate supply curve. So we have pi, which is inflation, and y, which is real GDP. This is inflation. So different from the macroeconomic graph where we have price and quantity, in the macroeconomic aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis, we'll have inflation as the price or the general price level, and y, which is GDP, real GDP, as in the overall quantity produced. So as we know, we have a long-run aggregate supply curve, which is a potential output, or Y star, and a short-run aggregate supply curve. And let's assume that high inflation is actually occurring in this economy. And because of high inflation, let's redraw this. Let's try to get this across. Okay, so now we just made it over the equilibrium point. So assuming that it does start at equilibrium, demand would eventually respond to AD2. Now let's assume no government intervention. What would happen to employment in the very short run? So this is classical economics, where they believed in no government intervention to occur. Where Keynesian economics believed that macroeconomic demand policies and macroeconomic supply policies should, just macroeconomic demand policies, I should say, should actually alleviate these troughs, or these booms, or these troughs in the business cycle. So with no government intervention, this business cycle may be a more fluctuating cycle, or a more volatile cycle. But let's assume that no government intervention occurs in this graph. So what happens is, we can see that at point A we're starting equilibrium, but because aggregate demand has gone down due to high inflation, the equilibrium quantity supplied, or equilibrium quantity demanded, would be at Y1. What this means is there is an contractionary output gap. And what this means is that we're in this phase of the economy. So we're moving towards, from a peak where high inflation, and we're moving towards this this trough phase in the economy. So we're moving towards, from a peak to a trough. So what happens here is, because we're experiencing a contractionary output gap, businesses will respond by cutting labor, because labor is the easiest cost to cut. So we can't cut capital costs, because they're very much long-term or non-current assets, but it's very easy to cut labor costs, because labor is very mobile, and it's a very liquid, not a very easy to dismiss asset, if you will. So aggregate supply would actually decrease in the long run. In the short run, aggregate supply would decrease from Y star to Y1. And so what happens here is, because of this contractionary gap, labor will be dismissed. And before, we talked about labor or unemployment as being a mixture of cyclical and structural unemployment. We'll see that cyclical unemployment will actually increase, because businesses will start to shed labor, and this is due to the cycle of the business cycle. So as we approach another trough or recession phase, due to low aggregate demand or decreasing aggregate demand, cyclical unemployment would increase. We can look at structural or natural unemployment as well. We talked about how aggregate demand, low aggregate demand, or high inflation can cause our exports to be less competitive. And now, as we know, our labor resources cost relatively more than in the international scale. So therefore, some firms or some exporters may actually experience a rapid decline in profits. And so what this means is that these firms become redundant. So let's take a look at the automotive industry, for example. They can't compete with the labor costs of, say, a low-cost labor countries such as Japan or China or Indonesia or India. They can't compete, and so therefore it requires government subsidies to actually help them survive. But in times of high inflation, this would actually worsen the problem, and so they had to shed labor, and this causes cyclical unemployment. But when they become unneeded, or when the government realizes that this industry becomes less efficient, jobs will be shed. And we've seen this in the news. So there will be job cuts. We've seen how the Toyota plants in recent months, they've cut a lot of jobs. They've cut around 500 jobs, and so has Holden, so have Ford. They've shut down industries because the labourers become structurally redundant. And so what this means is that the unemployment rate will therefore increase, and this is very bad for the economy. Because when unemployment increases, this would actually affect our income distribution, our external stability, our aggregate demand, the inflation rate as well, and our overall economic growth. And we'll talk about that in our lectures on unemployment. But as we can see now, high inflation can be a very bad problem. And let's put a cross next to that, because it is a very bad problem, because it can increase the unemployment rate due to both cyclical and structural factors. Now you can see using the long-run aggregate supply and the short-run aggregate supply analysis, we will see that there will be a decrease in total output of the economy, which causes structural and cyclical unemployment to both increase. But assuming that the government doesn't actually act on this, we're eventually going to see a movement from the point B to the point C here, and therefore inflation come back to its normal or equilibrium point at, say, 3%. But this movement here along this graph and back to the potential output that we've seen at point A may be a very long process, and therefore if the government weren't to act, living standards may deteriorate. And we'll talk about why the government uses macroeconomic demand policies and macroeconomic supply policies to make this process a lot faster, even though it may be at the expense, or maybe at the consequence, of an inbuilt higher inflation rate to the economy. But to recap this lecture, we've seen that high inflation can cause the unemployment rate to increase, both structurally here and cyclically there.